Thank you everyone for joining this morning. My name is John Pollack. I'm the coordinator of the National Coalition for Civil Right to Counsel. And we're really pleased to take this opportunity to share some information that hasn't been super well publicized about how CARES Act funding has been used to provide tenant representation in light of the right to counsel movement and how these funds can be used to advance the right to counsel. We've got a lot to cover in today's session. We've scheduled 90 minutes. We may take a little less if we can, but we're hoping that you will all learn a lot today, and we're going to give you a chance to ask some questions, which you can put into the chat box or to the Q&A, and we'll try to get to those at the end. We probably won't do those until the end, just in the interest of making sure we give our panelists enough time to get through everything that we'd like to do today. So I'm going to ask my panelists to just introduce themselves real quick, and then we'll go through some preliminaries before we get into why you're here today. Dan, would you mind starting us?
Sure, thanks, John. My name's Dan Atkins. I am the Executive Director of Community Legal Aid Society. We are a unrestricted non-LSC legal aid program in the state of Delaware, where I've been an attorney for the last 30 years.
Thank you. And Ashley?
Hi, I'm Ashley Lowe. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Lakeshore Legal Aid, and we're an LSC funded program. We provide services in the Detroit metro region.
Thank you. And Michelle?
Hello, I'm Michelle Gilbert. I'm the Legal Director and the Director of the COVID-19 Eviction Prevention Project at Lawyers Committee for Better Housing in Chicago. We are the non-LSC program. I spent 30 years at Legal Aid Chicago, the LSC program, and started at Lawyers Committee on the day that the CDC announced the eviction moratorium, which was very exciting.
To say the least, I'm sure. And Patrick?
Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Cicero. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Legal Aid Network, or PLAN. We are the organizing entity for civil legal aid in Pennsylvania, and we fund 14 independent programs, 8 of which are LSC funded and 6 of which are specialty programs that do an array of civil legal aid work, including, but not limited to, eviction defense and landlord-tenant housing. And look forward to talking about how we've used COVID money to help accomplish that.
Thank you. And Barbara?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Barbara Schultz. I'm the Director of the Legal Department at Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. We are a 90-year-old organization that is LSC funded.
Great. And our bonus speaker, Janine?
Yeah, I'm the legal counsel of Orange County, North Carolina's eviction diversion program. It is an in-house program housed under our Human Rights and Relations Department, and I provide eviction defense.
Thank you. And I called Janine our bonus speaker because we learned about Orange County very recently, and we're probably going to wind up featuring it on a separate webinar, so stay tuned for that. But we will give Janine a chance to say a few words if we can squeeze it in today. So just, actually, my final speaker is here. Jeremy, would you mind just, hi, Jeremy. Would you mind just quickly introducing yourself before we get started?
Hello, everyone. Sorry I'm late. My name is Jeremy Brown. I'm a Justice of the Peace out here in Harris County, Texas, where the city of Houston is. As a JP, we have original jurisdiction in eviction cases. So. Great.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go through a couple of preliminaries before we get started. My coalition that I run, the National Coalition, the civilrighttocounsel.org is the website where you can find out all the information we track, including this information about CARES Act funding that we keep track of. We have a lot of participants, about 350, and another 200 plus partners in 40 states across the country. If you're interested in being a participant, I'll have my contact info at the end of the presentation. I urge you to reach out to me. We basically encourage anyone to be a participant except those who actually are in government. For conflict of interest reasons, we can't have government participants in the coalition. The context for this basically is that the right to counsel movement is a really significant and thriving one across the board, actually, not just in housing, but especially in housing. We have 7 cities now that have a right to counsel. That was all accomplished in the last 3 years alone. We have another 24 in the works across the country. And what's really exciting is that it originally was a city level effort. I can tell you there are 6 or 7 states that we expect to see bills for in 2021. And at the federal level, there has been increased interest from Congress in this issue. There were bills filed in both the House and the Senate last year. We have all of that on our website if you're interested in going to take a look to see what has already happened, what's happening. We don't generally publicize on our website the stuff that's kind of in the works, because we wait until there's been a significant development, especially something that's public, before we go and start talking about it on the website. But for things that have already happened, you'll see that on the website. If you're curious about what's happening in your jurisdiction and you're not sure, feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you to those who are working on it. This is from the website. This is just the snapshot of the places that have gotten CARES Act funding. And as you can see, it's a wide array of jurisdictions. And I can assure you that this is not a complete list. This is just those places that we were able to learn about, which is not easy. There is no centralized database of this. This is through our networks. We were able to hear these things. And as you can see, the funds came from different places. They're different amounts. And this is probably just the tip of the iceberg. And I will say that although the CRF is scheduled to end at the end of this year, CDBG and ESG, those sources of funds from the CARES Act, are not set to end at the end of this year. And some places still have unallocated funds in those 2 pots. So this is not a moot conversation from that point alone. And additionally, we expect that there will be more city and state money coming in the next round. And if it does, this conversation will happen again about how that funding might get allocated. So we encourage you to be thinking about that in your jurisdiction. I would also add that if Congress does provide rent relief in the next package, which it's looking like they will, then that money, which cities and states currently use CDBG for, they're going to have a new pot of money for that. They're not going to need to use CDBG for that. So doing some advocacy about getting that CDBG money repurposed for other things like a right to counsel is a very important conversation to be happening in 2021. So what we're going to talk today, and I'm going to ask my panelists to talk about, are 3 things. One is how are the CARES Act funds being used for eviction, diversion, or direct representation? How did a right to counsel factor into getting that funding, or was there another persuasive factor? And despite the fact that the funding is obviously temporary, because we're talking about CARES Act funding, how can it advance something like a right to counsel, which is not temporary, which is intended to be a permanent installation? Prior to this meeting, I circulated a document which had the basics for for each of these programs to all of their registrants. If you are a very late registrant, you may not have gotten that. I'm going to put the link in the chat for everyone to that document, so anyone who did not see it can take a look at it. But that document has, for each jurisdiction, how much was allocated, from which pot, which agency gave it, and the very basics of the program in terms of how it operates. So my speakers today are going to not go into a tremendous amount of detail on the program details. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my first speaker, Dan, to talk about Delaware and how so Dan, if you wouldn't mind taking us through this, how it's looking in Delaware, that would be great.
Sure, thanks, John. So let me just briefly provide a little context for sort of the lay of the land in evictions in Delaware. So 85% of landlords have representation, less than 5% of tenants have representation. There's no minimum amount of money that needs to be in dispute in order for a landlord to file for an eviction, and it costs only $45 to file. And most significantly, landlords can be represented by a property manager in court. They do not need to retain an attorney. And it takes about 6 weeks from beginning to end, from time of filing to the time that the papers are posted on someone's door. So the message is, evictions are cheap, easy, and quick in Delaware. We are not called the business state for no good reason. This is the way we operate. And so with that context, in Delaware, we've been successful in seeing that some CARES Act money, CDBG and ESG have been put towards rental assistance. About $40 million has been put towards rental assistance. This is keep in mind, Delaware is a tiny state of a population of 1 million. And this was counties and state pooling together their CARES Act money to create this really big pot. Of course, if Congress doesn't move, much of that is going to have to go back to the federal government. But I think we're all hopeful that another stimulus bill will result in either an extension on that or more rental assistance money. Also, the money's been used for money to seed our Right to Counsel movement and to create an eviction defense ecosystem. And I'm representing my own organization, Community Legal Aid Society, the non-LSC funded legal aid group, but I'm really speaking on behalf of the Legal Aid Network of Delaware, which is just 3 civil legal aid organizations. It's the LSC program, Legal Services Corporation of Delaware, and our volunteer lawyers program, Delaware Volunteer Legal Services. So together, the 3 organizations are working really closely together, side by side, in advocating and creating this ecosystem. We have built a team of supports to try and address the coming eviction crisis, and we've been really framing this as housing is health, and that this is part of the public health response system needs to be addressing an eviction crisis. We've also been clear in arguing that this crisis is not new. We've had an eviction crisis around the country, including in Delaware. It's just going to get worse. And we also try to disabuse people of framing this as sort of a natural disaster. We argue that this is a man-made situation, and the solutions are up to us how we respond to this natural phenomenon of a pandemic. But we have the choice as a community how we respond to this. We've sort of set up an array of systemic supports. We have consultants, key among them, Stout. They're an investment banking firm out of New York City that's been instrumental in supporting, developing the Right to Counsel movement around the country. In particular, Neil Steinkamp has been instrumental in working with us and in advising us as we've moved forward and trying to figure out how can we most effectively, efficiently use this money that we now have. We're also working with local academics from the University of Delaware and Moravian College, particularly James Tufel from Moravian College, who has a lot of experience in public health analysis and economic analysis, and Steve Metro from the University of Delaware, who has some significant experience in homelessness. And so they're helping us analyze court data and how to frame and look at the statistics that are emanating from the Delaware court system related to evictions so we can help tell our story. Another part of this system that we're creating that's crucial is community members. We're partnering very, very, very closly with grassroots organizations in the community and trying to make this Right to Counsel movement not a lawyer-generated movement, but actually a community-generated movement, and relinquishing some control to the community members to help say, this is a priority, we want this, and this is what the right should actually look like. We've also engaged a dedicated project director. At first, we were sort of limping along with me nominally leading it, and we've retained a project director to really administratively keep us on task and keep all of these complicated moving parts working together. And we formed an advisory council where we're bringing in stakeholders to the table to help advise us. Cobbling together CDBG money, ESG money, foundation money. We've been able to start to build a response to this eviction crisis and build the Right to Counsel movement. How did we get here? Well, we've been talking about Right to Counsel with natural allies for a couple of years, I would say. And I'd say natural allies in state government, in the county government, and in city government. We really started in earnest, though, at the beginning of the pandemic when we formed an ad hoc advisory panel committee. We tried to make it bipartisan. And when I say bipartisan, I mean advocates for tenants and advocates for landlords. We had some landlord attorneys and we had some landlords on this committee to try and formulate some recommendations that we could make to the governor and to local government as to how to spend the CARES Act money that was coming their way. That was done with the best intentions, and it sort of devolved after about a month or two of difficult work, where we weren't really able to reach a consensus on anything other than establishment of a significant rental assistance fund. We were hoping that Right to Counsel would also emanate from that, and it didn't. We disbanded that group after about 2 months and splintered off with a smaller version of that, including some landlord interest, but just not as much as we had before. And those recommendations, though, were very helpful. And the key recommendations that emanated from this group, and again, this was just an ad hoc group that we formed. We just formed, organized it and called ourselves, this ad hoc working group on pandemic response related to housing issues. And it sounded official, and we pretended to be official. We also included state and local government officials on this group, and that was crucial for us. So folks that had the purse strings at county government, representatives of our state housing authority were also on this group. They were natural allies. They were not strangers to us. We've had deep, long-standing, close partnerships and collaborations with these officials for years. We have grants with them. We serve on committees with them. We are very close partners. So this was, really key for us. Emanating from that ad hoc group, two key recommendations were, $50 million towards a rental assistance fund, and Right to Counsel should be established. Subsequent to that, we did not have to ask the Delaware State Housing Authority and the 3 local counties in Delaware each appropriated money from their CARES Act allotments to the legal aid network to do eviction defense work and to support the building of the Right to Counsel movement. Again, we didn't need to ask because of these relationships that we've been building. They anticipated our need, and that was a beautiful thing. We also have an extremely close relationship with the governor's office and our chief magistrate. We maintain regular contact. We talk on the phone, we meet by Zoom, we share ideas, we share information, and we understand in a mature way that this is there's a creative tension inherent in our relationship. We're in the middle of a lawsuit against the governor on something unrelated. We've threatened our state housing authority with a lawsuit regarding to how they were administering the rental assistance money. But when you have good, deep, long-standing relationships with trust built in, those kinds of tensions are inherent, and folks understand that's the role that we play. And so, the key is being a partner, collaborating without being co-opted, obviously. And I think we've been successful in doing that. And then finally, I want to just wrap up by talking about a little bit about this pivot into the building the Right to Counsel movement and where we are. We're very, very early on in that stage. We're just starting to talk to legislators about proposing legislation in this next term that begins in January. We've sort of softened up the community. We're working on an op-ed that we hope to have published in the next week or two that'll be talking about this as an important antidote to the public health crisis. We're collecting data and assembling, developing this, what we're calling an ecosystem of supports that will address this eviction crisis. And when I say an ecosystem of supports, we're talking about developing apps to get at the default rate. We're talking about technology, triage systems, We're talking about alternative dispute resolution is being implemented. We're using pro bono counsel. We're using low bono counsel. We're using legal aid lawyers to try and address this. We couldn't build this ecosystem go from 0 to 60 overnight. That was a challenge for us. The market in Delaware, you could give me $1 million. We couldn't hire enough legal aid lawyers that quickly. So we need to look at the system that we have around us and try to cultivate that and develop that and build on that. Who knows what the eventual right will look like? Our hope is that it will be chiefly legal aid focused, but we're gonna build this ecosystem as smartly, as deliberately as we can, and use this as sort of a trial period over the next year as we're trying to represent as many people as we can that are going to be facing eviction, and take what we like, build what we like. But this is a marathon, not a sprint, and we're hoping to build something for the long haul.
Thank you, Dan. That was fantastic. You really covered a lot of ground, and it's really, I think, interesting the way that you got funding from, a number of different government sources, not just one, both county and state level, that it came from actually all three pots, from CARES, CRF, CDBG, and ESG. That there's just a lot, I think, from your model that people can learn from. I know that you put your contact info in the chat, which actually you might want to do again, because I think people who joined after you put that in won't see that. So if you wouldn't mind putting that in again. I know our speakers in general are going to be happy to serve as resources, and we often make these connections to jurisdictions for people who are interested. So thank you. That was great. Let's move on. We're going to turn to Jeremy now, if you wouldn't mind talking about the story in Houston and Harris County.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Jeremy Brown. Here in Houston in Harris County, to kind of put in context, the city of Houston is 2 million people. Harris County is 4 million. So, and city of Houston is a county seat. And so really it was a lot of different players, kind of what Daniel was talking about. We had as justice of the peace, have original jurisdiction in eviction cases. Now, quite frankly, because JPs are elected positions, there was a lot of pressure on me and my colleagues about evictions, period, right? I mean, there were protests outside of folks' courthouses. There was a groundswell from the advocacy organizations, particularly grassroots organizations, of emails calling us out. And to the point where the city, the mayor, and our county judge, which is our county executive, wrote a joint letter to JPs trying to get us to stop doing eviction cases. And so it was an opportunity that presented itself. And we all, the city and the county did rental assistance programs, but quite frankly, they were run out of money, and it really didn't put a dent into the problem. So it really started the legal aid community. Our legal aid, our LLC organizations, our Lone Star Legal Aid, primarily led the charge with, we have 3 law schools in Houston, right? They have housing clinics, and with our Volunteer Lawyers Association kind of came together, really wanted to figure out how to help folks get representation. And so with Lone Star and their internal funding really started a right to counsel pilot out of my court. So kind of put it in context, Harris County has 16 JPs. And we have 8 different precincts, right? 2 JPs in each precinct. And so they wanted to start the idea, but kind of the administrative piece, as a way to talk to my colleagues about the political pressure they were getting, I was like, hey, we need to show that we're doing something to help folks, particularly low income folks. So I convinced a few of my colleagues to start the pilot in my precinct and 2 adjacent precincts, right? To kind of help them with the political pressure. Then the county and city, before I became a justice of the peace, I worked for one of the county commissioners. And in Harris County, a county commissioner has as much power, even more than a county judge. They're able to put things on the agenda, and they're able, and as long as you have the 3 votes, we have a 5-member commissioners court. As long as you have the votes, you can pretty much do anything. And right now we're in a place where we have the votes on commissioners court. So literally one of the commissioners that I work for, he called me talking about evictions. I said, Commissioner, Commissioner Rodney Ellis, and really he's been spearheading. I said, Commissioner, one of the things that we can do is not only do rental assistance, talk about, making sure folks, particularly low-income folks, will have access to an attorney. Because at the end of the day, an eviction is a legal proceeding, right? It's a complex system. And regardless is, hey, we don't have a lot of tenant protections in Texas. Our state legislature won't allow it. We treat housing as more of a commodity than a right. But on a local level, I was telling him, hey, there are local things you can do, and kind of playing the politics of it. So he literally put the item on the agenda for Commissioner's Court to approve $1 million. Challenged the city to do the same thing. And so the county put $1 million, the city put $1 million, right? But of course, it's the administration piece. So we were trying to figure out, would the money be dispersed amongst the legal aid community or primarily go through Lone Star? That is a slow process because we're building this from scratch, like Daniel was talking about they're doing in Delaware. But from my perspective, I let the program people figure that piece out. I'm just a politician. I just throw the bombs, right? I'll tear the house down and hopefully we can build it back up. But trusting the other stakeholders in their role, right? The legal aid community having to hire attorneys, right? Trying to figure out the logistics. From the court's perspective, what we did was put a note in our citations about contacting Lone Star, and we had a dedicated line. But hey, we're still trying to figure out the advocacy part and making sure folks know about the right. Our citations are like 4 or 5 pages long, and our eviction process is as short as Delaware's, right? So if somebody gets a citation, all they see is that court date. So we're still trying to figure out ways so folks can know that, hey, they can call legal aid, they can figure that out. And so we're still, those are those barriers because people think, oh, I hadn't paid rent, I don't have any legal recourse. Well, you do, right? And getting folks, particularly those individuals that are, some of our landlords aren't the friendliest of people, right? And so, people are getting locked out and all this other stuff. And so we're trying to figure out that piece. Another important piece of why it was important for the city of Houston and Harris County to put money in, because the LLC requirements and immigration status, right? There was a concern that folks, Lone Star couldn't represent folks who may have immigration issues, right? So that's where the other, the 3 clinics and the volunteer lawyers were able to help, right? They fill in that gap. But when you're dealing with legal clinics, you're dealing with students, and because we were dealing with all those barriers. But I think the important thing from my perspective was telling the story of why legal representation matters, particularly, and quite frankly, just playing the politics and reading the optics. Evictions is a hot topic, right? And we know that rental assistance by itself does not work. And telling the story to and leveraging the relationships I have with the county commissioners, leveraging the relationships I have with members of city council to tell that story so they would be more comfortable in putting money into this type of effort. And then in other pieces, Commissioner's Court is going to do an analysis of the effectiveness so we can make this a long-term deal, right? I don't want this to be at the end of the day, we should learn from crises. And I always use the example, and as I tell the story, I use the example of the Great Depression and the New Deal. In the short term, FDR had programmatic changes, programmatic fixes. But there are long-term fixes to make sure we're not in this process again. And so the long-term fix is part of that process is a right to counsel. And we're going into session next year. Our legislators going into session next year. So not only telling the story for our city council members and our county commissioners, but to our legislative body. Now, the Texas piece, the state, we are red as can be, right? That is a longer term deal. But making sure that narrative is out there. Messaging, media outlets have been talking about maybe having a right to counsel, right? As part of the process of keeping folks housed. So it's the messaging from, making sure that your local media outlets, the local media outlets, talking to our stakeholders, the county and the city, talking to the legal aid community, but also talking to those grassroots activists. That really is a big piece because, hey, I'm a lawyer too. And sometimes those attorneys are very linear in how we think about things, right? Very, not understanding it has to be a messaging, kind of a groundswell approach to make sure this is sustainable. But we still have our barriers. One of our biggest, getting our legal aid community to buy into doing an evaluation piece. Not getting them to understand we're not trying to evaluate your individual program. We want to make sure we're trying to build better policy, and that's a hard sell, right? And hey, I'm still trying to sell it, but it's a continued working together, the relationships, and so it's all those things combined to make this effort work. And we're still in the beginning stages, right? But I think there's at the least there's buy-in for folks to keep on talking to one another.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's great. And what's interesting about Houston is the fact that in 3 of your courts, that everyone is getting counsel. All the tenants are getting counsel, and so you're really modeling what a right to counsel will look like to the city and the county and everyone else, and to the court. To get everyone familiar with that concept of everyone gets counsel, not a screening process or anything else. So, do you see that that aspect of it, the fact that you're giving counsel to everyone, being like a selling point as you go forward talking about a right to counsel?
It is. We focus, not everybody, low-income folks.
Right.
Only
Yes.
Yeah. But again, hey, people still, we still have a hard time for folks to showing up to court in the first place, right? And I think it's telling that story and an effectiveness. I think there's still different visions on what that looks like. And that's why you got to continue to engage. Because these are, again, the legal aid community with the advocacy organizations, they just see things different. The politicians see things different. My fear is once, quite frankly, evictions has always been an issue. Housing has always been an issue. But because everybody's affected, not just poor Black and brown folks, like we have a political will that I am afraid the window's going to close.
Yeah.
And so we're and kind of right now, again, using the FDR model, like do as much as we can right now while the window is still open, while people are actually paying attention to evictions and the crisis of evictions and how to do it. And not just, I think getting people to understand that rental assistance by itself is not going to help. It really has to be a totality effect.
And I will say that nationally, we are seeing that message coming through much more in general. We're seeing people recognize the importance of legal representation right now more than probably we've ever seen it in the last year. It's terrible that this is what it took to get to that level of awareness. But as people say, never waste a crisis. So we're trying to really leverage this moment. Ashley, would you like to go next?
I would love to. Thanks, John. So I just want to kind of echo a little bit about Dan and Jeremy have said is it feels to me like so much about this is relationships, what we have done before this crisis, preparing us for this crisis, and then using those relationships going forward. So that to me is kind of the essence of what we're talking about. Just a little bit of background for Michigan. We have a statewide eviction diversion program. And in that program, it's $50 million for rental assistance, $4 million for legal assistance across the whole state. And so we're all taking our pot of that money and providing eviction diversion representation. I'll be talking more about the different pots of money that we have because we really have a different situation in the city of Detroit than we have throughout the state. But I think it's good to see the two different diversions of the way the funding has gone. So our eviction diversion program, that funding has allows us to do most types of eviction work. So we could do representation in anything that's related to COVID, when most people's problems are related to COVID. But what we're finding is because of the magnitude of the rental assistance program and the heavy process nature of it, we are spending most of our time doing eviction diversion work and have really kind of limited work in terms of termination cases or other types of cases. So in the city of Detroit, we are staffing every single eviction docket that the court has. We have a couple lawyers there. Our lawyers are there representing people waiting in the virtual waiting rooms. I will say in Detroit, all of our hearings are virtual. outside of Detroit, that is not true. Most of our service area is, but in Michigan, there's plenty of courts that are still having people come in person. But we do meet in Detroit virtually with those folks, and we just spend a lot of our time helping tenants to apply for rental assistance. So once we have explained the process, maybe negotiated the amount of money that's due with the landlord, then we're helping the tenants fill out their application that has to be printed and signed and returned, and provide proof of income, which has turned out to be a big problem. I think there's a presumption that low-income people have access to a printer and a scanner and solid internet bandwidth. And we probably all know on this call that that is not true. And so that's created all kinds of barriers to helping people, even though the funds are there, helping to make sure that people have the resources that they need. At the beginning of the crisis, we got some assistance with providing hotspots and providing the tools for folks to participate in Zoom hearings. We thought that was really going to be the barrier. So we set up hotspots in our parking lots, and we got tablets that we could share with clients so they could participate in hearings. That really hasn't been the issue. Courts are allowing them to participate by phone if they allow them to participate virtually at all. So that hasn't been the barrier. It's really been the follow-up with the paperwork. And it seems like a dumb thing to focus a lot of energy on, but it has been a huge barrier in getting those funds out to people to keep them in their homes. Our version of eviction prevention work in 2020 has been all hands on deck. So unlike what Dan said, like we got a commission and we got the staffing for it, we just jumped in and I have a eviction hearing tomorrow, if that gives you a sense of how all hands on deck everything is. We do have some funding going forward into 2021, and we'll be pulling back on that. So we'll be saying these are designated eviction prevention staff that is a result of the COVID funding, and let the rest of our staff go back to the other work that they were doing, because it really pulled us away from doing non-eviction stuff. I feel like I don't even know how many cases we have closed in the second half of the year in family law, which is usually a big part of what we do, and benefits, because we're so focused on helping people with eviction. There's two pots of money. The statewide funds came to us as a result mainly of the work of the State Bar Foundation. Our foundation funds most of the legal aid programs in the state, certainly the LSC funded ones, and that foundation has been working closely for several years with the state legislature, the governor's office, and agencies to find ways to help get additional funding for legal services into their budgets. So not just coming out of the general fund, but in a specific area in an agency's budget. So that our foundation has been working on that. And so those relationships were in place when this money came through the CARES Act. So our State Bar Foundation volunteered to administer the funds for the legal aid. So that was $4 million statewide. And our foundation said, hey, we can do this. And they have distributed it in consultation with the legal aid programs, which was great. And we could talk about what we could spend and what we couldn't spend and what seemed reasonable. So we have really worked closely together with all the other legal aid programs. We have 5 LSC funded programs in the state of Michigan. So working closely to make sure that we cover the whole geographic area. And so I think a lot of it was based on those relationships that have been in place. In Detroit, things looked a little bit different. There are 3 legal aid organizations in the city of Detroit that do most of the city's eviction work, and we are one of them. But we have been a part of a coalition working together pretty closely since the end of 2018. We have been working to establish and lay the groundwork for a right to counsel in the city of Detroit. And so we had a summit back in March of 2019, which feels like 20 years ago. And we have since then been meeting with key players in the mayor's office, in the city council, and working to establish a support for the right to counsel, also working with the private bar. The corporate counsel has been really supportive of this, and also engaging with tenants' rights organizations in the city of Detroit. So really trying to build a broad coalition to develop that. That had been going on, and then we found COVID. just before our state shut down, and maybe even the day before, we had been in meetings with the chief judge of our court in the city of Detroit, along with court administrators and the bar, talking about how we might expand services that were available. So we had this team that had been meeting, monthly to talk about how we can improve services and expand resources. And so that group was able to coalesce and say, okay, now we have this crisis, what can we do? So we shift those meetings to virtual and kept talking about what we could do to meet the needs of the people needing to stay in their homes. So I think that was that key piece, was those relationships. So even before we had our statewide eviction diversion program, the city expanded its grant of our CDBG and ESG funds to include legal aid. So it wasn't, it happened because one of those legal aid programs, the United Community Housing Coalition, already had a contract with the city to provide rental assistance and relocation help. And so the city was able just to modify that contract to add in significant funding for legal services in the city and additional rental assistance. So we went from, they went from about $500,000 to really $2.8 million to support legal services just in the city. So that it was that contract in place that made that happen, and those coalitions that allowed that to happen pretty seamlessly. I will say that was not true outside of the city. So where we didn't have necessarily ongoing discussions about right to counsel and additional services, that didn't happen. So in our service area around the whole Metro Detroit region, Detroit is the only place where we receive those CDBG and ESG funds directly from the local government. So we are hoping and planning that this temporary funding is really going to help make our case for a right to counsel in Detroit and even at the statewide level in a little bit longer term. So before COVID, we had been working with Neil Steinkamp and Stout to develop a cost benefit study for the right to counsel in Detroit, working in close partnership with the U of M, who has a poverty solutions group that is also doing some data collection. And so we were on our way to creating this study. Of course, we paused some of that work when the beginning part of the pandemic, but we are moving forward on that again and hoping to use that study to compare what we think will be a number of different scenarios. So unlike the studies that happened in the past with Stout, where they would say, here's the current version of things and here's what we could do with the right to counsel, I think we're able to say now, here's what we are doing with representation. And so what we hope to compare is, pre-COVID, where we have a lot of what Dan mentioned, 5% of our tenants were represented pre-COVID and 85 to 90% of landlords were represented. So that was the pre-COVID situation, and very, very little rental assistance available, to what was happening in the second half of 2020, which is essentially full representation of all tenants who appear for eviction hearings. We also have the problem of people not appearing, but for those folks who came, we provided lawyers, and then of course, significant rental assistance in that package. What happens in 2021 is every day is a new day. We're not sure, but we do think in 2021 we'll reduce the level of representation, that we probably won't be able to provide attorneys for every single person who comes in, and we'll be looking, actually coordinating with Stout about helping us make those decisions about who we should be providing representation to, but thinking in terms of people who will still get the next version of eviction diversion funds and maybe subsidized cases, or people who are seniors, people who are disabled, finding those categories of people rather than just across the board. So we'll see a little bit different of a package that we can compare that data and say how were our results looking in that situation. And then I expect by the second half of 2021, we'll have to reduce some staffing again, and I expect we'll have a little bit less rental assistance. Although, of course, I had got an email during this meeting where that may, there's hopes that won't happen. So we'll wait and see how all those things happen. The last part of what we think is really going to help continue to propel our efforts on right to counsel is the continued relationship building. So we had been working closely with the city. We continue to do that. Right when the eviction diversion program started, we launched a citywide eviction prevention hotline that is staffed by both the housing agency and legal aid programs. So clients are able to have one single number that they can reach out for to get help. And that has been promoted widely by the city and the housing agencies. We're meeting on a weekly basis with really high levels of folks at the court, the legal aid programs, the housing agencies, to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the community. And so I think we are, developing kind of long-term processes for how we will work together. Some of the things that we've done, we had a problem where people were not appearing for their eviction hearings when we were having those hearings in the fall. And one of the issues was that our mail is not getting through. The mail in Detroit kind of stopped and was not happening. Things were taking a month to get across town to get notices from the court. So people weren't being notified. So volunteers and staff from the city were doing door knocking. They were going out and knocking on the doors of tenants who were set for hearings or who had missed one hearing to make sure that they knew that they were supposed to be in court. So that kind of cooperation and making sure we're helping tenants and making sure we're meeting those needs. I really think those things are going to help us solidify things as we continue to move forward.
Thank you, Ashley. Just two quick notes. One is that the interconnection between rental assistance and legal representation is one we're really seeing play out right now in terms of how much of a difference that makes in the effectiveness, especially in places with really bad law. The rental assistance is the transformative factor. And the other thing is that, with the coronavirus relief fund money having to be spent by the end of the year, it's pushed jurisdictions to spend a lot of money really fast, which has allowed essentially some places to flood everyone with counsel in a way that we've never been able to do before, which really gives us a chance to see what that looks like and how it works. So as we continue to think about that, just keeping that in mind, that the broad, when you do a broad swath, it starts to look like a right to counsel, and you can start to model what that would actually look like. I just want to thank my panelists so far for really doing a great job of staying on time so we can get everyone. We've still got 3 folks to go. A lot of great information to hear. So Michelle, would you like to go next?
2 background pieces of information. Illinois has had a strong eviction moratorium in place the whole time we've had the eviction prevention project going. So that has obviously impacted our work. Lawyers Committee for Better Housing has really 4 elements. In addition to legal aid in housing, eviction court and housing court, we had a pre-existing social services department, and we have a data analysis and policy advocacy wing. So though the court-based rental assistance was already in place, and a data analysis piece was already in place. So we have used we received additional rental assistance money to administer and to grant to clients. But in addition to receiving money for attorneys, we received money for rental assistance managers, case managers. And because of the eviction moratorium, we've used a big chunk of attorneys on negotiating with landlords. We've done lockout protection, both affirmative litigation against landlords who have locked out tenants, but also a lot of negotiation. Chicago has a good anti-lockout law, and we've been successful in getting people back in their homes once we point out that there's a good lockout law. And from the outset, community engagement and community legal education was an important point because, as others have said, right to counsel or access to rental assistance are only as good as letting the community know that they're out there. Like everyone else, we had already been doing a lot of right to counsel work with the city of Chicago. The data analysis, I'm going to share specifically a link In our prior data analysis, we had been able to actually substantiate the disproportionate amount of attorneys for landlords versus tenants, and also the efficacy of providing an attorney. And in particular, because there are some private tenants attorneys in Chicago, the efficacy of providing a legal aid attorney in terms of getting a case settled, getting or winning a case, or getting a court file sealed. The two links I put in the chat, one is just generally to our webpage where you can get to our eviction data portal, which has really dramatic evidence of the disproportionate impact of eviction on the basis of race. And the other is actually a link to a registration for a program tomorrow where we're going to be announcing more eviction data in conjunction with Loyola Chicago. So it was being able to use this data, like I said, the efficacy data that was very helpful in persuading the city of Chicago about the right to counsel. And that was the genesis of our receiving the grant to start the eviction prevention project. Since the Department of Housing grant was the first grant to get our project started, since that time, the Cook County, so that's the county where Chicago is located, has apportioned CARES Act funds to other legal aid providers to provide eviction defense, actually some of the money for representing modest income landlords, and consumer debt defense as well, through an existing legal aid network that has been really marshaled by the Chicago Bar Foundation, which is the foundation aspect of our local bar association. And the leadership of the CBF was really important because it not only involved the county policymakers, it involves the judicial system, because we're not, so that was money for some representation. It started later than our project, but there's a commitment to funding going into 2021. But it's not just a matter of having attorneys in court if the first court date is a trial date. And so we have to literally be screaming at people, hey, hire us. And so in general administrative order was just entered that the first, beginning January 9, 2021, the first eviction court date is not going to be a trial date. It is going to be a case management date. And a case manager, which is sort of a step up from a clerk, will refer people to the early resolution program where people will be able to consult with attorneys. And since that time, the state of Illinois has also expressed interest, and we don't know what direction that'll go in 2021. Obviously, right to counsel is potentially a lot of money, and all states and local government are hurting right now because of the additional expense of the coronavirus. So, we are very excited about the state's interest. And I will say, as someone who is not from Chicago originally, we need a lot of legal assistance in Chicago, but we need a lot of legal assistance outside of the city as well. And obviously, we are working about gathering data about our project. There's just like a whole little wing that is very interested in data. But I will say a little bit differently than what has been said already. I think that we do need to consider just how strange 2020 has been, and how there are so many variables that make the last several months not very good for proof of concept of right to counsel. Just all the remote work, the constantly changing laws. you know, the very high unemployment. So it has been a strange year. So I think, you know, we do want to continue obviously working on right to counsel. I don't think that a cost benefit analysis of what I've done over the last 4 months is necessarily the best argument for it. However, I tried to go through this pretty quickly to save some time for questions.
Great.
And I would encourage folks to look at our data.
Yeah, and I shared a copy of the direct link to the attorney representation effectiveness study that LCBH did in the chat, so folks can see that. It's a really great analysis that was just recently came out, and Michelle shared her contact info. We're going to move to our next panelist, but before we do, I just wanted to mention to my other panelists, there have been some questions asked in the chat as well as in the Q&A. If you want to take a look at those, and even the questions that are marked as answered in the Q&A, you can also answer your own sort of answer to those questions. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those. So we're going to turn to Patrick to go next.
Thanks, John. And it's really encouraging to hear what everybody else is doing across the country. And it's exciting, and a lot of things we can try to replicate in Pennsylvania. Before I talk specifically about Pennsylvania, I do want to flag, and John mentioned this at the beginning, that if in fact the $25 billion in rental assistance is included in whatever CARES Act 2 relief that is currently being negotiated as we speak, and the language remains the same. The compromise bill had in it that 10% of the rental assistance pot, up to 10% of the rental assistance pot, can be used for housing stability services. So a state could choose to use up to 10% of that money for housing stability services, which is defined pretty broadly and includes things like case management services, services connect eligible housing to other public supports, rehousing services, and eviction prevention services, which we're starting to message to our state legislature and governor's office should include legal services to prevent eviction. So there's an opportunity, even in this CARES Act money, that even if there's not state and local relief, and even if there's not other things, there's an opportunity in the rental assistance pot itself to think about how you pair some of the things you're talking about, both rental assistance and legal services. And $25 billion is a lot of money. So what your state gets and how that's allocated, and 10% of a state's allocation could be a significant amount to continue forward some of these projects. So look, until it happens, nothing's guaranteed. And then you also got to convince your local and state officials to make this happen. But I would encourage you to start thinking about beginning to plant that seed now with the folks who might have some control over this. And it gets to my first point, which is how are we using this and what is required? As my fellow panelists say, it's about relationships. And we, when the CARES Act money was first allocated, we got CRF, Coronavirus Relief Fund CARES Act money. In Pennsylvania, legal services was allocated $8 million of CRF money for a broad array of civil legal services. Ordinarily, we handle about 75,000 civil cases a year. About a quarter of those are housing related cases in a given year. This $8 million in funding didn't have specific strings attached to it that you had to do housing or other types of cases, but it came up in the context of our negotiations, the negotiations of many of my colleagues in our system over a rental assistance and foreclosure assistance funding that ultimately went to our housing finance agency. So it's pretty intimately tied to the need to do housing advocacy. As a result of that, we don't have all of the final data yet because we're still gathering it. In Pennsylvania, our General Assembly restricted the use of this. Our money had to be spent by November 30th. So even though the federal CARES Act would have allowed it to go through December 30th, ours had to go be spent by November 30th. We could go from March 1 to November 30th. And so we have kind of finalized case data and data through the end of September, and we're working with our programs to get the rest of the data. But through the end of September, we handled about 1,600 cases with this COVID money. 850 of them were housing cases, were landlord-tenant eviction-related cases, whether they're in public housing, private housing, et cetera. The vast majority of those were these combination of helping people get rental assistance and dealing with the underlying cause of the eviction. We had various fits and starts on housing moratoria in Pennsylvania. First the Supreme Court imposed moratorium that went through, again, in fits and starts through June, and then a gubernatorial moratorium that had a few more holes in it that went through September, and then the CDC moratorium that had, so it's like this Swiss cheese model where depending on which moratorium you're in, certain people fell through various holes and we're still ending up in eviction court. And so our attorneys in our system have been in eviction court throughout, not to the same degree that they otherwise would have been in the absence of some of these moratoriums. So a lot of the focus of the CARES Act money was staffing up housing navigators that would help apply for and obtain and work through the obstacles of getting the eviction diversion, eviction rental assistance funding, and then working closely with lawyers for those cases that needed negotiation in court or out of court because they didn't meet one of the requirements of the moratorium. I have to say that our General Assembly was generous in appropriating $125 million for rental assistance of CARES Act money, but not so generous in the strings that were attached to it. And as a result of that, because of the short time frame, because of the documentation requirements, and because of some other bureaucratic obstacles, only about $26 million of that $125 million was used for rental assistance before November 30th was up. And so the rest of it went back to the state to be reallocated in this month of December for other COVID-19 related needs. So I'm not sure that that was a success. I mean, it was a success in terms of the amount of revenue that was thrown at the problem. But as we look at this next pot of funding, we're trying to really point out some of the obstacles and hardships that were associated with that. This money was distributed through our network, through the legal aid network. Again, we have 14 funded programs that cover all 67 counties, some of them LSC funded, some of them not. The funding was allocated we ordinarily allocate our funding pursuant to a funding formula that is kind of poverty and census based. We chose not to do that for this funding because of the nature in which we had to get it out. And so we really encouraged our programs to partner with other legal aid providers. And so it expanded the network a bit. So we incorporated a bunch of people who we didn't ordinarily fund, including some of these community-based organizations that do housing navigation. And that was pretty successful in terms of getting people in the door. I think Jeremy mentioned this idea that people just aren't showing up to court. They get eviction notices or they get notices from their landlord. They're moving or they're leaving or they just don't show up because they don't think the community-based housing navigators and community-based organizations was a successful model, not only of connecting people to the appropriate legal aid attorney to navigate the legal situation, but also for purposes of trying to get rental assistance. And so we're trying to maintain those ties. We were fortunate to be able to pass money through to those organizations, which was really good. But now that that money isn't available, the trick is, unless we can get money from the second round of CARES Act funding or relief funding, is to try to maintain those ties and those relationships in a way that feels authentic and in a way that really helps tenants. The tie into right to counsel. Philadelphia has some quasi right to counsel legislation that was local, and that has been really a model for what we're trying to do in the rest of the state. But Pennsylvania is a pretty diverse geographic state, and our politics are all over the map, depending on where you are and what county you are. So we have some pretty progressive pockets and some other pockets that were not particularly interested in thinking about what right to counsel would look like. So we are working at a state level. There are a number of state legislators and our governor's office who are interested in thinking about the value that civil legal aid and right to counsel has in this housing context. The challenge really is, in my mind, within our legal aid system, there's a diversity of thought about whether or not every tenant needs legal representation, or how do you still preserve some screening process for the legal aid organization for purposes of determining, well, that there's like less merit to that case, because we don't know that we're going to get enough revenue to really think about what it looks like for every tenant. And I think that this pot of money that was dumped on us was helpful in showing the impact and efficacy of having a combination of resources, rental assistance resources, and legal resources. And so we're making the push both for this next round of funding to the extent that it's appropriated, and just generally about what right to counsel looks like. Our messaging around obtaining this $8 million was that legal aid is part of the frontline response to responding to COVID-19. And among them, the largest hardships would be homelessness and eviction, that would either cause people to literally be homeless in homeless shelters, or be homeless de facto because they had to double up, right? And cause increased occupancy in homes. And so that resonated with a lot of skeptical audiences. So the idea of sheltering in place without a home really resonated with folks to say this is really important. And so now the trick isn't the right word. Now the concept is that we need to pivot to say, look, this is true in non-pandemic times too, that there are so many hardships associated with eviction. And to Michelle's point, that there's so much that's unique about 2020. We don't want policymakers to say, well, that was just limited to when we were in COVID, or that was just limited to the real unique hardships of 2020. And so it's been a balancing act to not overplay the public health crisis associated with eviction, although that is in fact true, and not continue to say eviction is always a public health crisis. Eviction is always a crisis for our communities. So there is a bit of a balance to that. All right, I think I'll stop there and let others speak and then participate in the Q&A. But I appreciate it. I'll put my contact information in, but appreciate the opportunity to speak about what we're doing in PA.
Thank you, Patrick. That was great. And I will mention, just for the sake of inclusion, that the state, at least one, some of the legislators have shown an interest in right to counsel. They had a hearing, which some of us testified at, about how to advance this issue. So we're excited by that, and these funding infusions can only help with sort of responding to that legislative interest. Okay, Barbara, your turn.
Sure. Yeah. So Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles opened what we called our Eviction Defense Center back in the 1980s. And we were pretty much the only game in town at that point. In 2011, the state of California started funding more eviction defense services through the, I think it was called the Sergeant Shriver Act. But even with that, between all of the Shriver programs and the private attorneys, I'd say we were lucky to be getting maybe even 10% of the total number of tenants needing eviction defense. So about 2.5 years ago, the Los Angeles Renters' Right to Counsel began, and there are about 10 legal services programs, both LSC funded and not, probably a dozen tenant organizing CBOs, academics, and of course tenants themselves. We devised a framework for what we wanted, and it consisted of outreach and education services to be delivered primarily by the tenant organizers, and then obviously legal services to do both prevention work and eviction defense, and rental assistance to be overseen by the legal service providers. So we came up with a plan on how to phase this in, kind of like New York did, through zip codes. Los Angeles County has 10 million people, so it's always going to be a process. So we entered into negotiations with both the city and the county of Los Angeles. And I'm going to say in February or March of this year, we were about to sign a contract with the county of Los Angeles to cover, I think it was about 6 zip codes in maybe 2 courts when the pandemic hit. And at that point, political will changed somewhat, and they still decided to fund the program, but not in the right to counsel model based on limited zip codes, but rather throughout LA County, where we have 11 courthouses. So it kind of became a little, became an eviction prevention program, kind of along the Shriver model. So that was one unfortunate consequence of the pandemic. Meanwhile, we were still negotiating with the city. I should say that program started, the prevention side started in July of this year, and then the eviction defense portion started in September. Like some of the other panelists, California and Los Angeles City, County. Los Angeles has 88 jurisdictions in it, so that's fun. And they all have different tenant protections in place. Our courts were kind of not quite shut down, but shut down for evictions for the beginning of the pandemic, but then they opened back up in September. We do not have a great relationship with the Los Angeles courts. They refuse to provide us any data on evictions, and they are going full steam ahead with trials. So it's mostly all the pre-pandemic cases that we're seeing. They're even moving trials forward, despite the fact that we are presently in a pretty big lockdown due to a surge. They are requiring tenants to show up for trial even when they have COVID and are symptomatic. There have been numerous cases of exposure in the courts, and still the evictions press on. We have been spending most of our time doing a lot of hearings on lockouts based on the CDC order, which of course is set to expire in a couple weeks. So that's kind of the lay of the land. In terms of the funding, LA received about $200 million for rental assistance of the initial CARES Act funding that had to be spent down by this year. It was done on a lottery system. It was not terribly effective, I would say. Plus, in the high rent areas, especially where in jurisdictions with rent control, a lot of landlords just refuse the funds. They would rather figure out a way to get the tenants out. We are seeing a huge increase in tenant harassment, in illegal lockouts. So we're dealing with all of that. Meanwhile, we are in negotiations with the city of Los Angeles, and they are providing about $5.7 million in CDBG CV funds for both legal services, and about $1 million of that is for rental assistance. And then actually some additional rental assistance that the city is going to provide. So hopefully that program will begin in January once we get a contract in place. For those who are interested in finding out more, the Right to Counsel Coalition is also known as stayhousedla.org. That is our that is what we call the program piece of it, as opposed to the campaign, which continues to get a full right to counsel and a codified right to counsel. So so the interesting things for us about the pandemic is it actually kind of steered us away from the actual more pure right to counsel model. Obviously, though, there definitely is more political willingness to fund eviction defense. In LA and really throughout California, a lot of that, even pre-pandemic, was based on trying to prevent homelessness because there is such a large homelessness problem in LA in particular. So we also are very concerned about the concept that this is only a pandemic issue, even though we've been talking about it for years beforehand. And the one thing I will say about that the federal funding is obviously fantastic and gives us a great opportunity to prove what eviction defense can do. It does come with some limitations because, as one of the panelists already mentioned, because of the rather onerous requirements of the funding, such as the backup documentation. So that's kind of what we're dealing with now and trying to figure out how we can do that, especially working primarily remotely. There's also, of course, the huge digital divide issue, where we are very concerned that tenants who don't have the ability to find us online are not getting to us, even though obviously we use phones all the time. So those are some of the concerns that we have. I didn't want to talk for too long because I think folks probably have some questions that we'd like to answer. So I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Barbara. That's fantastic. And Los Angeles is, it is really hard to sort of figure out how to think about right to counsel in this environment. As many of the speakers have said, this is a very strange environment to be trying to predict what a future model for housing would look like, because so much is temporary right now. But at the same time, showing how the right to counsel can respond to any crisis that we are going to face is also extremely helpful, and how tenant representation can help weather this crisis. And getting that message across, regardless of whether the parameters of that nature of that crisis change in the future. What's really fascinating for me too, to hear from all these programs is, you all are from very different geographic locations. You've had different pots of funding. They're being used slightly differently. You had different amounts, but the right to counsel is in the conversation for all of those. We don't know exactly how we're going to transition in 2021 to looking to the future about what the movement is going to look like. But your projects offer a lot of hope, and whatever data and lessons we can get and bring to the other jurisdictions that are looking to do this is going to be immensely valuable. And I guess one question, actually, we have about 9 minutes left. There are some questions in the chat. I think the Q&As have mostly been answered, but there's a recent question. Have any programs identified national funders interested in funding right to counsel? Have any of you had any national interest from a funder? I'm not sure how national would qualify, but how would you respond to that question for anyone who'd like to answer it?
I know that the LA Right to Counsel Coalition definitely has some foundation funding. I can't recall off the top of my head what those foundations are, so I'm not sure if they're national or not. But we are partnering with a small foundation, the Liberty Hill Foundation, and they subcontract to the tenant organizing groups. So they're very good at looking for foundation funding.
Just saw that Mackenzie Scott just gave away $1 billion yesterday. That's quite a, what was that, on a Tuesday? Maybe she's got another, I don't know, $500 million that she can spare for this movement. What do you think, John? Can you make an ask to her?
Yeah, I'm sure that our cold email would do just great.
She spread it around to states. She gave to an HBCU in Delaware and in Pennsylvania. She's I don't know. She's looking to have an impact on people of color and marginalized populations. And I don't know. It seems like it's an opportunity there. And yeah, I just don't know. She's got screens and layers protecting her. I don't know how you get to her, but someone got to her, right? Someone got there.
As far as national funding, I will mention that one of the things that we're working on trying to support is there's an effort to get some money into HUD's budget for legal representation for next year, and that would be money separate from what LSC gives out to all the organizations. And we're hoping that I haven't actually seen whether the budget came out last night or this morning and whether that's in there or not, but I'm planning to take a look. But that's one avenue to get some additional funding. And so it would be specifically for tenant representation. That's the goal. I don't know if we had any other questions that we didn't answer. There was one that I got emailed very early on about, which I think we've answered really, about what money can we pursue for, what advocacy can we be pursuing for future CARES Act, COVID and other funding. And I think all of you have really answered that question really well. As far as bolstering national partnerships to tell the story, that's largely, that's part of what my organization's job is. That I will also give a shout out to Voices for Civil Justice, which is a great organization if you don't know them already. Their job is to tell the story of legal aid, about how legal aid makes a difference and why it should be funded. They're terrific to work with. You can get media support for them. They can land stories for you locally and nationally. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. Also, this is not going to be the last webinar that we have. We're going to have more in the spring on related subjects, including seeing how all of this is going and where there's new funding opportunities. And we're also going to talk about just giving a sneak peek for Janine's project, the idea about having in-house, in her case, a county actually having its own representation program, which is a really unusual project that we hope to profile. And actually, Janine, if you could say just like a couple of sentences about it, just real quick before we wrap. We've got about 5 minutes left, just so people can get a sneak preview for what we might be talking about in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So the county actually approved the program on June 2nd, 2020. They had been in conversations for the last year about having a program, and it was a matter of whether it would be internal or not. And I began as legal counsel middle of June. Beginning in August 2020, I have been in the courthouse for every small claims session in order to speak to unrepresented tenants and to represent tenants in court. And we also have a social worker who conducts an analysis and connects tenants to county resources for other issues beyond just their legal issues.
And you're funded in half by a CARES, I think it's CRF, right? That is funding.
Exactly.
Salary. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So that's, and we're going to talk about, I think one of the things we're going to talk about on a future webinar is this very interesting idea and how it came to be. And we're also going to talk about the fact that it involves partnership with social workers, which is something that increasingly is becoming a model out there, partnering with either organizers, which is what's happening in Virginia, or social workers, and how that can enhance the legal representation experience. Because as we all know, when we do legal aid, we're essentially forced into the social worker role, despite the fact that we're not trained as social workers, and there are people who could be much better at that part of the case handling. And really, in my mind, that's a really important piece, could be an important piece of the right to counsel model. Did anyone? I think I think we answered all the questions except for a general summary of actual logistics of attorneys representing all clients. Is there any sort of screening that takes place for clients when you're representing everyone? Do attorneys have an opportunity to meet with clients? So I think this is a question for, especially for Jeremy, although really it would be Lone Star that would answer that question probably because they're the ones actually doing the representation. Or maybe, I don't know, for Ashley or anywhere where you're doing that, like how are you handling it where you're trying to reach everyone?
Yeah, John, I can address that if you'd like. We are representing, I mean, it's everybody who's low income, but in the city of Detroit, that's really including everybody. And so the way it's set up is we're in Zoom waiting rooms. And when the tenant comes into the Zoom meeting for their hearing, the judge says, do you want to meet with legal aid? They're here. Then they send them over to us where we meet privately with them and we do a full intake. Or as much as we can in the time that we have, but we screen for citizenship, we screen for income eligibility, and I think as someone said, it's a huge pain because it's a lot of information to get, but we do that screening there before we file an appearance for the client.
And then, I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do here in Harris County is partner with Lone Star Legal Aid have these iPads and kind of create a kiosk in every court annex, so that Lone Star can screen folks before they come through court in the first place. But when you're dealing with big bureaucracies, you got to get you got to get your attorneys involved. You got to get our tech IT folks involved. So it's a big system trying to get, but it's one of the efforts we're trying to do, as opposed to just having the number in our citation.
And I will say that scaling up is part of a right to counsel. It doesn't happen all at once. Like most of the rights to counsel that have passed, or a number of them, are being phased in over many years, and that's on purpose. It takes time to set up these systems for screening. It takes time to hire attorneys. It takes time to train supervisors. That doesn't make it any less of a right. As long as there's a schedule that's in the bill, it's still a right to counsel. There can be a lot of political headaches about who gets to go first and how that works, but that's a very real part of how these have been implemented.
Hey, John, can I have one more comment?
Yeah, sure.
I would say we're barely starting to get the right to counsel for criminal cases right. And, Wainwright's been a long time. So, you know what I mean? So this is an ongoing process.
Yeah, I remind my colleagues in Pennsylvania that Pennsylvania is the only state that does not fund its public defenders at the state level. We still rely on public defender funding at the local level. I mean, every other state does except for Pennsylvania. And so this idea about like state funded right to counsel in civil cases is really, really hard. But we're working on it. So that incremental approach makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
and I will say that, having come after Gideon, with the right to counsel movement really, launching heavily in the 2000s, we've had at least some benefit of seeing what's happened with Gideon and the implementation issues and trying to learn from that experience and how we do the right to counsel for civil cases, which, by the way, already exists in a lot of civil areas, but at least for housing where it hasn't existed, we're, really trying to learn from that experience and build the right things into the legislation from the beginning. So we're right at the 90-minute mark. I wanted to thank you all, thank my fantastic panelists for doing such a great job of sharing so much information in such a short time. We'll be doing more of these, and we look forward to your future participation and look forward to hearing from you if you secure funds to advance the right to counsel in your jurisdiction. So thank you so much.